Okay, good morning, still morning. Today we're going start start a new chapter that talks about the conflict that was between the Catholic and other religions. There was a conflict. So as an introduction of this section, yesterday we talked about the Black Death, right? And today we're going to talk an event that a uh, very dark period for the Catholic Church. Was the Inquisition. Okay, the Inquisition, the church was uh, seeking for people who doesn't believe in the Catholicism. So they think that they are the enemy of the Catholic Church. So they decide to create this institution, and the institution was known as the Santa Inquisition, Santa Inquisition. Okay, so I'm gonna play a video, and I want you to see and try to understand how this one. It was a very, as I said, it was a very dark period in the Catholic Church. Okay, and you're gonna see different kind of church torturas that the people that belongs to that institution did to innocent people. Why? Because they didn't follow Catholicism. They did it against the Muslims. They did it against the Jewish. Okay, against everybody who was against the Catholic Church. So let's watch and see what happened during those days.
Most of us live in a world where we're free to pursue whatever spiritual path we see fit and worship whatever god or gods we fancy without fear of reprisal or persecution. That was not the case for medieval Europe, however, when starting in the 12th century, the Catholic Church launched a bloody inquisition that would last for hundreds of years and see tens of thousands of people tortured and executed, all in the name of their version of God. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today we're taking a look at some of the greatest horrors of the Inquisition. Christianity, originally conceived in ancient Israel, was at its inception persecuted as heresy by the Jewish leaders of the time. Jesus was famously humiliated, beaten, and ultimately crucified for his claims that he was the living Son of God. And after his death, his closest followers went into hiding until, fueled by their belief that Jesus had risen from the dead as promised and thus proved that he was the Son of God, they began to spread their beliefs in Jesus as Savior. This led to their becoming known as Christians and the original disciples. Many would suffer terrible fates at the hands of the Jewish leadership. Over 1,000 years later, though, Christianity had arisen to become the prominent religion across Europe, and in a bit of irony, it now became the faith that persecuted Jews for their beliefs. Yet Christianity was being challenged from both within and without, with many Christians deeply unhappy with the Vatican's abuses of power and calling into question problematic Catholic dogma. Others who simply wanted to worship God in their own ways were also threatening the power and influence of the church, and that could not be tolerated, publicly proclaiming that there could be only one road to God and all else was dangerous heresy that threatened to steer people away from God's love. The Inquisition was launched in the late 12th century, though sadly the truth was that the church was more concerned with securing its own power and wealth rather than the souls of the faithful it claimed were being threatened. The inquisitors were specially trained priests who were instructed in the art of discovering heresy and rooting it out, then extracting penance and confessions from heretics, almost always through torture. When an inquisitor arrived in town, he would immediately announce his presence to the local population and would give citizens present a chance to admit their heresy. If they did, then they would be doled out a punishment befitting their level of heresy, everything from a forced pilgrimage to holy sites in Rome to severe whippings which could scar a person for life. For inquisitors, true penance could only be achieved through deep pain. Thus, most inquisitors would make use of special bullwhips, which would come with small metal beads at the end in order to deeply lacerate flesh. Others still use used a tool known as a cat of nine tails, which was a whip with 9 extensions, typically with each one inlaid with pieces of sharpened metal. The wounds would be so severe that often those receiving this punishment would die from infection or be crippled afterwards. Those that survived bore the scars for life, their backs forever disfigured by the horrible whipping. This was, of course, lighter punishment reserved for those who freely confessed. If one did not confess, the inquisitor would immediately begin their investigation, calling in local townsfolk for one-on-one meetings. Citizens were encouraged to speak up about the heretical practices of their neighbors, and once accused, there was often little evidence needed to determine guilt. This led to many cases of revenge in the form of false accusations by angry neighbors, or perhaps just by individuals who coveted the lands and even the wives of others for themselves. With the scantest proof of heresy, one could convince an inquisitor that their neighbor was a horrible heretic, deserving of the fires of hell itself. Of course, the church itself hardly ever needed much incentive to persecute people as heretics. Count Raymond VII of Toulouse would regularly burn people at the stake for heresy, even if they had confessed when given an opportunity, because often those who were persecuted were Jews, Muslims, or other religious minorities. The process of killing them was little more than a handy way to cleanse the population of undesirables. That included gays who were persecuted under the laws of sodomy and brutally tortured before being killed. In the Kingdom of Aragon in Spain, the Inquisition only stopped giving out the death penalty for sodomy after almost 1,000 trials, most of which ended with torture and death for the accused. Diego Rodriguez Lucero, an inquisitor named the Bringer of Darkness, operated from 1499 to 1506 and routinely used the power of his position for self-gain. Once, he sent an innocent man named Julian Trigueros to burn at the stake so that he could take the man's wife for himself after his death. And later, when he desired one of his many mistresses for himself, he sent her husband and parents to burn at the stake. Nobody was safe from Lucero, and in 1 year, 1506, he handed out 100 death sentences. Eventually, the Marquis of Cordoba sent his army to attack Lucero's prison and set all inside of it free. Unfortunately, Lucero escaped, but he was so hated and thoroughly corrupt that the Grand Inquisitor in Rome had him arrested 2 years later, because trying Lucero for corruption would be the Catholic Church as the pot calling the kettle black. Lucero was quickly released, and in a frustrating lack of karmic justice would die peacefully in Seville that same year. For the Inquisitor, extracting confessions was paramount, and it mattered little whether they were real or false. Inevitably, the accused would face one of many different forms of punishment, which weren't meant to actually punish the individual, but rather to just get them to confess. One of the preferred methods of exacting confessions was called strappado. In this form of torture, an individual would have their hands tied behind their back and the rope attached to a pulley. They were then raised so that they would hang from their arms, which would inevitably lead to the shoulders being pulled out of their sockets. Often, the inquisitor would raise the victim up high and suddenly drop them before catching their fall, forcing the body to jerk violently. As if this wasn't enough, weights would often be tied to the person's feet to make the hanging even more painful. The rack was yet another popular tool of the Inquisition, and a very effective one at that. Here, the subject had their hands and feet tied or chained up to rollers at one or perhaps both ends of a wooden frame. The inquisitor would then slowly turn the rollers with a handle, which pulled on the ropes or chains and stretched the victim's arms and legs until they dislocated. Sometimes the process would simply continue until limbs were torn off completely. Even though mutilation was forbidden by the Church, in 1256 Pope Alexander IV gave inquisitors the power to forgive each other for any wrongdoing they committed during their torture sessions. This meant that the inquisitors were free to add any form of torture they could dream up to victims who were enduring the torture of strappado or the rack, and thus they often did, because why waste a good chance to mutilate someone? If confessions weren't forthcoming, or perhaps the inquisitor didn't quite believe they were honest enough, they could get inventive with their bound-up prisoner. This would include the use of devices such as the boot, which was a wooden-framed shoe that was placed on the foot of a victim and was slowly tightened until eventually it crushed the bones of the feet and lower legs. Another popular device was the thumbscrew, which was made up of small inserts for each of the fingers on a hand, which were gradually tightened until they crushed the finger bones completely. For women, one of the most horrific implements of torture was known as the breast ripper, which was nothing more than a prong-like iron device which would be heated in a fire and then affixed over each breast, with the inquisitor violently ripping away the breast tissue until there was little more left than a mass of cauterized tissue. All of these were things the victims would suffer, along with their normal torture, and designed to not just extract confessions, but ensure that the guilty would be forever marked by the ordeal. The Judas chair was number 3 of the top 3 torture devices used by the Inquisition, and consisted of a pyramid-like seat with a sharpened point at the top, upon which the accused sat. The point of the pyramid was forced into the anus or the vagina, and the inquisitor would gradually force the victim down upon the device by lowering them from above by ropes they were attached to. Sometimes the ropes were attached from below, allowing the inquisitor to turn a crank and slowly force the accused down onto the device. Ironically, this was seen as the most humane of the 3 main methods of torture, and this would rarely lead to death and instead would disfigure the person and create lifelong difficulties walking. For women, it would basically make childbearing all but impossible. A milder form of punishment was known as the heretic's fork and was an ingenious device which consisted of a 2-pronged fork-like device. The device would be tied around the person's neck, and one end of the fork would be placed below the neck, digging into the lower jaw. The other end of the fork would be gouged into the flesh of the chest, securely holding it in place. Thus, the victim would be unable to move their head forward at all without impaling themselves, and the act of speaking was excruciatingly painful. Victims would often be left like this for days before trials, in order to encourage their cooperation, even if those trials more often than not ended in being burned at the stake. For any who wished to avoid their ultimate fate by trying to impale themselves on the fork, the prongs were placed in such a way that doing so was impossible and would only lead to even more pain instead. The Nuremberg Virgin, or Iron Maiden as it's often known, was a sarcophagus-like device in the shape of a woman, with a Virgin Mary placed atop it by the Inquisitors to symbolize the triumph of Christianity over heresy and dissidents. Models differed, but in essence they all worked the same way. The victim was shoved inside it and then had the door thrown shut. In some models, the inside of the maiden was rigged with spikes several inches long. In others, there were no spikes, but instead small holes through which long nails could be thrust through. In order to keep a victim from dying too fast, though, the spikes or nails were situated in such a way that they did not pierce any vital organs, thus ensuring the victim could stay alive for a long period of time. Models differ, but generally, the victim was stabbed through in both the shoulders, lower back, in 3 places across the chest, on each buttock, and once in the stomach. Some models had special slots for inserting nails that would impale the victim through the eyes, but not so deeply as to penetrate into the brain. Inquisitors may throw someone inside and leave them until they died of their wounds, the victim trapped in the enclosed space and unable to move without deepening the wounds they are already suffering. Other inquisitors would slam the door to the maiden open and shut several times, stabbing the victim through over and over again. Curiously, this device was meant to symbolize the victim entering into the embrace of the Virgin Mary herself, an act that symbolizes the Catholic Church's absolution of the accused's sins. The Spanish Inquisition was a time of legalized horror inflicted upon the religious minorities of Europe, mostly Jews, pagans, and Muslims. Often the motivations were nothing more than a desire for more wealth and power, with the church seizing the assets of the accused, even if they were allowed to live after the accusation. Men in power who coveted the wives or lands of others would send innocent men to be executed, and jealous lovers betrayed their partners to the inquisitors for revenge. While the Inquisition was meant to combat sin, it ironically only ended up enabling some of the greatest sins in European history. Today, the world casts a mistrustful eye toward organized religion in most parts of the world, partly due to the heritage of the Inquisition and its many abuses. Yet, while we like to think we're far removed from such barbarism, one can't help but wonder, given the particular, almost religious-like zeal of some extreme far-right political movements around the world, just how far we really are from a new age of torture in the name of God.
Okay, enough of church. Okay, so you see, I remember once when my mom is from Peru, and remember by the conquest, the Spanish went to Peru. They conquered that area over there in Peru, and then my mom took me to it's like a museum, and in that museum they show different devices that they used in those years in order to torture the people. So as you see in this video, it was really something terrible back in those days. Okay, so anyway, this was really a very, very dark period in the Catholic Church, and it really exists. Okay, yes. What was your question? Excuse me, ¿con la batalla what? ¿Con la batalla what?
No, profe, esto era para... yo cuando fui a Estados Unidos,
Ajá.
yo fui a un museo de tortura.
Ajá, yes, yes.
De esa, esto no sé, me permite, yo tengo fotos, me permite mostrar al menos una que fue la que era un poquito gráfico, pero
Sí.
era ese pinchito que tiene como que una especie de tenedor de dedos que
Ajá.
iba en el mentón y en el pecho.
Ajá, y lo cortaba todo, sí.
Me deja
Imagínose.
mostrar una imagen.
Dele, va a ver, dele, a ver.
Es algo gráfico, pero bueno.
Dele, rapidito.
En la parte de acá el pincho está ahí. ¿Lo puede ver?
No, no lo podemos ver porque no te he dado acceso. Déjame ver para decir. El problema es que ahorita mismo no sé, no puedo
No, lo
salir.
estoy mostrando en videocámara, en la cámara, no estoy compartiendo pantalla.
A ver, déjeme ver para ver. Prende la cámara para ver.
Ahí está.
A ver, enseña. Ay, Dios mío, sí. Sí, así
Y
mismo era.
esto,
Horrible, sí.
y acá los encerraban ratas en el estómago, le ponían ratas en el
Uy,
estómago en una jaula y esperaban que las ratas entraran.
Profe, eso todavía se hace, eso todavía se hace.
Será en otra parte, pero no, en la iglesia católica no, debe ser
Ah,
otra.
no, ahí no, pero en otras partes sí lo hacen.
Sí, debe ser en el Medio Oriente, por allá, qué sé yo, clase de
No, qué
tortura.
asco.
Sí.
Ya mostré las
Pero
imágenes,
bueno,
tengo un montón.
okay, so,
ese museo fue muy chévere.
The idea that I wanted to show you this that really exists in those ages. In the Middle Ages, it does exist, the Inquisition. Okay, so that's why I wanted to reinforce these events that took place during those days, and also the Black Death. Okay, now let's begin. Okay, the church now, because I told you the church, they have some conflict because other people they were concerned. Why? Because the church they were more interested in getting power and treasures. And that's why, remember, last week we discussed that there were a group of people from the church that they separate and they create another Catholic order, like the monks and the friars and the nuns. So during those days, because they saw that people were against them, like it says over here, around 1100, the Christian had begun to question church teaching. They thought that the clergy focused more on money and land than God. So people who hold ideas considered heresies, are called heretic. Herejes, son herejes, o sea, que no creen en la iglesia, okay? Son enemigos de la iglesia. So church officials sent priests and friars throughout Europe to find possible heretics, okay? In the year 1200, Pope Innocent III decided that heresy was too great to threaten to ignore. So they call a crusade. Remember, there was another crusade for Holy Land. Now they call another crusade against the heretic in South France, and it lasts around 20 years. Hold on. Here it is. Let me move this. Oh, Christian fights the Moors. Now the Moors were the Muslims, okay? Now the Christian fought the Moors in Spain and Portugal in an effort to drive Muslims out of Europe. Remember, back in those days, there was a fight against the Catholic and the Christian and the Islam, okay? And they tried to conquer as much territory as they could. So they were, let me see, there's a picture over here. They took over this area. The yellow area, like it says, belongs to the Muslims' land, okay? They cover all this area. So they tried to recover all this area, the Spanish and the Portugal people, they tried to recover, and they did it, and at the end, okay? Now the Muslims, they took over this area, also Sicilia, and other places around here. So they tried to invade and Portugal armed Christian warriors fought to drive the Muslim Moor out of their lands. By the late 900s, the 100 powerful Muslim government of Spain had begun to weaken. Political and religious leaders fought each other for power. The fight against the Moors. For centuries, the kingdom of Spain and North Spain had been small and weakened, but as the Moorish power declined, this little Christian kingdom seized the opportunity to attack and recover the land, like this one over here. And they call these events, they call it the La Reconquista or the Reconquest, Reconquest, sorry. So they took away the land from the Moors during the Reconquista. They call it the Reconquista or Reconquest. In 1085, Castle, that's a place, the large of the Spanish kingdom, won a great victory against the Moors, and they made them to retreat, the Moors, and they returned this area to the Spanish and the Portugal people, okay? Now, back in those days, there were some events, like I said, the rise of Portugal and Spain. As a result of their victories, both Portugal and Spain grew more powerful than before. Portugal, once a pair of Castile, broke free and declared its independence. In 1469, Ferdinand, the Prince of Aragon, married Isabella, a Castilian princess. Then 10 years later, they became king and queen of their countries. Together, they ruled all Spain as King Ferdinand and the Queen Isabel. Remember, they were the kings and queens that allowed Cristobal Colón to come to America and discover on the name of the kingdom, Spanish kingdom, okay? So let's stop right here, guys, and we have to continue next week. Why? Because it's almost 12:13. You have 2 minutes left. And also to remind you that next week you have your test, okay? No, I mean, yes, it's your test is next week. It's gonna be about the 5 first topics that we have discussed, the vocabulary and the assessment, okay? The 5 topics. Remember who are they? Which are they?